Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Of course, I am recording here as everything has changed in the last 24 hours. If you are, for the first time, seeing one of these commentaries or listening to one of these commentaries, welcome. I do these regularly. I have been doing them for a long time for my supporters and subscribers on Patreon. But let's just talk about what's happening here. Of course, there's so much to discuss. Russia has officially invaded Ukraine, not just sending in military into the Donbas region, but is now assaulting all major cities in Ukraine. Reports, and I'm recording here at 8:50 in the morning on the East Coast in the United States. That's on Thursday, February 24th. The Russian military is assaulting the ports of Odessa and other major ports, as well as key military facilities all throughout the country. Major cities, Kharkov, Kherson, others, as well as air raid sirens going off in Kiev, going off in other major cities, reports even in the West in Lviv and other cities that this is happening. So the Russian invasion is happening. It is fully taking its effect. It looks like something like a lightning type operation by the Russians, to be expected, of course. Now, I will readily admit that I didn't expect Russia to openly and overtly invade Ukraine. I'm going to talk about what I think about that and what that calculus must have been in a minute. But I certainly didn't expect it. I expected potentially, if there was going to be any military intervention by the Russians, it was going to be limited in scope into Donbass. But obviously, I was wrong, as many others were. Interestingly, U.S. intelligence seems to have been correct on this one, which certainly raises a lot of questions about how we should think about U.S. intelligence moving forward, and whether they lie all the time or just most of the time or some of the time. But that's another issue that we don't have time for right now. So as I'm recording, the assault is happening. These cities are under attack. I've been posting videos that I've been finding on various social media channels, Telegram and Facebook and Twitter, etc. This is a big operation. The Russians have committed themselves completely. Now, I would just quickly note that I don't really try to do military analysis. It's not something I'm an expert on. It's not something that I really feel qualified or competent to do. There are plenty of others who could probably do that. I would talk through some of the political context here and trying to understand what it is that the Russians are doing and how we might think about this moving forward. Part of the reason I figured that the Russians would not be launching a full scale invasion of Ukraine was that the Russian economy and the Russian political system at the moment is not terribly resilient. It is extremely one dimensional. Not only, I mean, of course, it is the supply of gas to Europe, etc. That is the bulk of Russia's economic activity, but it is also the exporting of weapons and nuclear technologies and a few other things. But for the most part, it is a fairly one dimensional economy. Now that it is going to be hit by these very wide ranging and very deep cutting sanctions, there is a very real question about what that will do to Russia's economic development or even Russia's economic survival. I did see this morning that the Russian ruble has fallen to its lowest value against the dollar in I don't know if it's ever, but in years. So, and with that being the case, that is just one early indicator of at least some of the economic pain that the Russians are probably going to feel from this. Now, it's obvious that Putin has calculated this. He's obviously figured it into his, calculus for this operation. He obviously figured the loss of Nord Stream into the calculus here. So he's obviously made the decision that controlling Ukraine, whether that's through outright annexing of Ukraine or through destruction of its military capabilities and permanently crippling it, and essentially making it a de facto kind of conflict zone, that outweighs the Nord Stream. I don't know what to make of that calculus. I think that he's wrong, of course, and I will lay out a number of reasons why I think Putin has made what amounts to one of the great historic blunders of our time. I would argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine here is probably going to be seen as a tremendous historic blunder, not because it means that the United States extends its hegemony for another 100 years. I don't think that imperial decline works quite in that way, but I do think that Russia has way overplayed its hand and miscalculated, both in terms of the mood of the European countries, but most importantly, I think he's miscalculated the nature of U.S. domestic politics. I think that was what drove a lot of this. Now, if you want to put it at a very simple level, of course, the Democrats and Biden and Obama and Hillary and all of the rest of these scum, they see Russia as the primary threat, Russia as the primary power to be encircled and decapitated, if at all possible. Whereas China is the primary threat to Trump and his, gaggle of fascist reactionaries that make up the bulk of what is now the Republican Party. They view China as the primary threat. And so this idea of a Democratic administration seeing Putin versus a Republican administration seeing Xi Jinping as the primary threat, I think is part of the let's call it the paranoia that may have creeped into Putin's mind. I think another part of this that is underreported in the West, and this is something that I read, gosh, I can't remember who wrote it, but a very, very incisive piece from a political commentator in Russia who noted that Putin has, for various reasons and through various machinations, sidelined most of the moderate voices that used to hold influence within his administration, those who maybe were moderating voices who could whisper into his ear and remind him of the dangers of what he might be doing. A lot of those voices have been sidelined. That's why we saw these op-eds in Russia over the last couple of months, openly questioning what Putin was doing, openly questioning the intelligence of, and sort of wisdom of moving forward with an operation of this kind, even assuming that NATO is the belligerent threat that Putin says. Many of these military experts argued that fighting over Ukraine was not the way to sort of push back against NATO's expansion, that there were other ways of doing that. And I think that the real underlying reason here is that war in Ukraine is deeply unpopular. And it's not just unpopular in Western Europe, it is deeply unpopular in Russia as well, despite what patriotic fervor might be whipped up by Russia's nationalist media outlets, that despite what Putin might say in his speeches, and despite what kind of chest thumping makes the headlines in Russian domestic political headlines or whatever, the reality is that most people in Russia don't want a war in Ukraine. Most people in Russia don't see Ukraine as a threat. Most people in Russia don't even necessarily see NATO as the primary threat. They see NATO as a threat. I think generally that's understood, but I don't think they see it in terms that Putin is seeing it. Much more central to people's concerns are things like the decline in purchasing power of the ruble, the declining standards of living, the widening gap between rich and poor, the lack of domestic political freedoms. There's many different issues that caused the street protests in Russia last year, that caused the major electoral defeats for Putin and the United Russia Party in the last elections. There's a lot of discontent in Russia and a lot of factors for that. And really none of that is attributable to Ukraine. And so and the other point I want to make here, and this is another thing that I think most commentators who are speaking on this issue don't speak about because they don't really know. Like I said many times, I'm a Russian speaker. My family comes from the Soviet Union. They're virulently anti-communist Russian Jews who left in the 1970s, but there is still some connection in that sense. I speak the language. I have some sense of the culture. I'm not an expert by any means, but I have some insight. And I can tell you that Russia is an extremely depoliticized country. And what I mean by that is your ordinary citizens do not engage politically the way they do in the United States or in Western countries generally. And this is the result of a lot of factors, including, sort of the single party communist rule throughout the Soviet period, Stalin's political, totalitarian kind of control that he had, etc. There's a lot of factors for that. But generally speaking, Russian people are not terribly political, and they're certainly not, getting caught up in their day-to-day activities with what's going on outside of Russia, and particularly in a country like Ukraine, which has this very long history connected to Russia. Of course, if you listen to Russian sort of imperialist apologists and Russian imperial revanchists like Dugin and Alexander Dugin and these various idiotic outlets like the Saker and Moon of Alabama and all of this horse shit. I mean, they talk endlessly from the perspective of Russian imperialism. They are Russian imperialists. They support Russian imperialism. It is historic, right? Russian imperialism is not some made up concept. This existed for at least 400 years, if not, if you want to go back even further than that. Okay, these are historic conflicts. I'm going to talk about some of these historic conflicts in a second, because we can't talk about any of what's happening without talking about the history that most people seem to totally ignore. The truth is, Ukraine and Russia are not the same, but they are historically linked. Russian culture and Russian history really begins with the Kievan Rus. Kiev is the center of what would later come to be called the culture of the Rus. And so it is historically connected. Now, the Russian imperial mind would say that not only are they connected, that Ukraine does not exist, right? That Ukraine was concocted by the evil villain of history, Vladimir Lenin, and those dastardly Bolsheviks. If you saw Putin's virulently anti communist speech the other day, which was despicable in almost every sense of the word, he essentially made the argument, and he's certainly not the first reactionary Russian imperialist to make this argument, that Ukraine doesn't really exist, that it was created by Lenin, and that it was foisted on the Russian people. Of course, he ignores the fact that the reason that ever happened in the first place was, first of all, in the context of Russia's civil war following the revolution, but more importantly, from an ideological perspective, because Lenin had the vision and sort of sense of justice in understanding the importance of dismantling the Russian Empire and of self-determination for the peoples of the Russian Empire. This was a critical breakthrough that Lenin made. This is what established what we now know as Ukraine, because Lenin basically said you can't keep controlling them by force the way the czars have done for hundreds of years, right? So the creation of Ukraine itself, it's not some Bolshevik conspiracy. It was an attempt by the Russian revolutionaries to allow the people of the former empire to be able to control their own destinies. Now, this is, I think, really critical in understanding, because when Putin talks about decommunization, he's not talking about removing statues of Lenin and Soviet iconography and things like that, which is what they do, what they call decommunization in Ukraine. When he says decommunization, he's talking about erasing the very concepts put forward by the Bolsheviks, erasing even the very notion of Ukraine, of a self-determining sovereign entity called Ukraine. Right. So that is textbook Russian imperialism. And of course, this has been propagated to a large extent by Russia's various media tentacles, whether through the various Dugin networks and their alt media platforms that they control, or through just a general lack of understanding and sort of accepting at face value the things that Putin says. The truth is, the left is almost entirely clueless when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to the real issues here. Yes, of course, NATO expansion is terrible. Nobody, as far as I know, on the left would actually support the continued expansion of NATO, which is a belligerent power and a threat. But the idea that Putin was forced to make this move is, of course, ludicrous apologia for the Kremlin. This is not exactly the kind of thing that sorry, I'm getting a phone call and I have to ignore that. This is not exactly the kind of thing that really should be supported by any honest left-wing voices. This is something that needs to be condemned. This is imperialism, and we need to be very, very, very clear about that. If you call yourself an anti imperialist and you're cheering on the Russians, you're a liar, a fake, a fraud, a hypocrite, and a disgusting piece of garbage. Okay, there are people who are going to die over this decision that Putin made, this absolutely unilateral choice that Putin made. He didn't have to do this. There were 1,000 different things he could have done. He could have sat back and waited for Trump to come into office. He could have done any number of things. But the fact that he did this shows you, I think, a new level of intensity when it comes to the realignment of the imperial chessboard. This is what I've been talking about. Was I correct in saying the Russians wouldn't go with an outright invasion of Ukraine? Of course, I was wrong. Many people were wrong. I was one of them. I've been wrong before. I will be wrong again in the future. But where I was not wrong, and where I think I've been proven not only correct, but will be proven correct moving forward now and in the future, is the realignment of the global imperial chessboard. That what Russia is doing has signaled for us that we are now in a very different global situation from what I came to learn about how the world works 20 years ago. My political life begins really with opposition to the US war against Iraq, 2002, 2003. This period where I learned about what imperialism is, where I began to internalize some of these ideas and shape a worldview for myself, was rooted in the idea that the world was dominated by a single global imperial system, and that global imperial system was headed by the United States, and that the United States represents the core of that imperial system, and not only the core of it, but in fact the sum total of it, because the system itself encapsulates all other countries, even those that for various reasons may oppose it. So China or Russia or Turkey or any other countries were in various ways part of a single global capitalist imperialist system. And I believe now we've entered into a period where that is no longer the case, where it is not simply one imperial system, but rather competing imperialisms, and competing imperialisms that are essentially looking to gain more or less at the expense of each other. Okay. And that is what Putin, I think, has really made abundantly clear. It's what I've been saying for a while, but it's what he's made abundantly clear here. Russia is in an alliance with China. Turkey is in an alliance with NATO. Turkey also has various overlapping interests with Russia. Turkey has overlapping interests with China. China has overlapping interests with Europe. Both Russia and China have interests in Latin America, where the US dominates. The Chinese are everywhere in Africa. The Russians have mercenaries in more than 24 countries in Africa. The Turks have won multiple wars in Africa and in the Caucasus. I'm referring to the war in Azerbaijan and the war in Libya. And of course, Turkey is also involved in Somalia and elsewhere. Now, the picture that I'm trying to paint here is one of a global imperial chessboard that is in flux, and that what we're witnessing now is another example of this. And Putin is, I think, making this very clear. Now, where does this connect to the history? Well, if you're looking at the map, of course, and you know some basics of European and Asian history, you know that the historic conflict between the Ottoman and Russian empires is very real. It lasted for several hundred years, and it continues today. And we are going to see this coming to the fore again, because if you think Erdogan is going to sit back and do absolutely nothing, that's, of course, ludicrous. Erdogan is a shrewd operator, a backstabber, somebody who will look for any opportunity. And Putin has blundered himself into a potential quagmire in Ukraine, and Erdogan plans on exploiting that. Similarly, Xi Jinping and the Chinese, now the media says the Chinese are going to make a move on Taiwan now that Putin has made a move in Ukraine. That that remains to be seen. The Chinese have never proven any ability to be able to carry out that kind of action, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't. Um, but the idea here being that the Chinese would take as a signal that they can now operate in this way, or the Turks can operate in this way. The truth is, the Turks have been operating in this way. What the Turks have done in Syria, permanently occupying Syrian territory, essentially becoming a permanent fixture in Libya, a permanent fixture in Somalia. Turkey is very much extending itself beyond its borders as well. So we see this happening in a number of places and in a number of ways. And this is a very, very critical development. Now, how does the chessboard change moving forward? This is not totally clear, but let's just keep in mind Ottoman Russian rivalry is not the only historic rivalry of relevance here. There are others, including the rivalry between the Chinese and the Turks. That is the center of the Uyghur conflict. Those are Turkic people who look at Turkey, not China, for their influence. Now that Russia has moved into Ukraine, how does China look at the Uyghur situation? Does China see the Russians as an honest broker, one that they can depend on as an ally? Or is now Russia so embroiled in a quagmire in Ukraine that they're not even going to be able to be relied upon by the Chinese? All of these questions remain up in the air. There's a lot more to say about all of that. I'm going to have to leave it there. I will post this one as soon as I can. And of course, if there's more developments later today, I will be on them. Okay, talk to you all again real soon.